Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Global Justice Report. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today. This is a new online production produced by the Center for Global Justice. The center is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world. Since 2004, we've been offering educational programs in English to expats and visitors, and programs in Spanish for the Mexican community. We've also organized educational travel to Chiapas and to Cuba. Our vision is to move control of economic life and relations with Mother Earth from the 1% to the 99%. Coronavirus has set in relief the failures of neoliberal capitalism. Our weekly Global Justice Report will explore various grassroots democratic solutions, including self-management, cooperatives, mutual aid, public banking, and a whole lot more. I'll give you a preview of coming attractions at the end of today's program. We welcome your suggestions for future programs, and if you have suggestions and or will have questions or comments for our speaker today, you can email them to this address, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. Just put question in the subject line so I can spot that email easily, and I will be able then to share it with others who are viewing. Some are viewing on Zoom, and others are viewing on YouTube. We're live streaming on YouTube. This program, as well as our previous programs, are all available on our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Our speaker today, David Bacon, has been a photographer for 25 years or so, documenting labor, the global economy, war and migration, the struggle for human rights. His articles on these topics are often appear in such publications as The American Prospect, The Nation, The Progressive. He's also published books. The Fields of the North is his most recent title. Earlier books include The Right to Stay Home, Illegal People, Communities Without Borders, and The Children of NAFTA. Later, I'll be showing you the screen from his website, but right now, I want to turn the floor to David, who will be talking about farm workers and their fight against the coronavirus. So take it away, David.
Okay, well, here we go.
You'll have to speak loud because your voice is coming through kind of weak.
Got it. So I hope everybody can see what's on the screen here. So I want to thank you for inviting me to come to San Miguel de Allende again,
Bacon
virtually this time.
has been a photographer for 25 years.
And thank the Center for Global Justice for setting up this webinar series. That's really important one, and I'm honored to be part of it. So I'm going to talk to you actually somewhat about the work that I do and how I go about doing it, its relationship with farm workers, and kind of present to you some of the voices of some of the people that I think have important things to tell us in relation especially to farm labor and farm workers. And at the same time, I'm going to show you these photographs here so that we can see the human face of the people that we're talking about. So I was a union organizer for 25 years before I started working as a journalist and a photojournalist, including many years working for the United Farm Workers Union. That's in fact how I first learned about farm labor and the life of people in rural areas and Mexican and Chicano culture, and learned Spanish. The union was a real school for me. Working for unions, organizing strikes like this one with United Electrical Workers in Pomona, California, made me an immigrant rights activist because I saw so many workers from other countries who were trying to organize. And I wanted to understand why people have come here and how and why they fight and how immigration laws and policies are used against them. So now I'm a photojournalist and writer, as Cliff said. I'm doing really, I always think of it as the same work, organizing, helping our movement to grow. So what I'm showing you here, these are not neutral photographs, and I'm not a neutral person. I don't claim to be an unbiased observer. And if the work I do helps to strengthen the movements for justice, well, I think it will serve a good purpose. So I want to talk to you about the people working in the fields on the Pacific coast who today are coming from places like Oaxaca and southern Mexico. I want to look at what happens to people when they get here, especially as farm workers. But before I do, I want to talk a little bit about the way I work and the reason why I do this. Several years ago, I was invited to a conference in Tijuana called El Gran Mexico to show images of Mexican workers in the US. And we called this show, as you can see on the left-hand side here, in Los Campos del Norte, Norte, of course, being north of the border. And the idea of this conference was that with 10%, or actually I think it's 11% of the Mexican people living in the United States, Mexico exists on the other side of the border as well too. And people need to know what happens to Mexicans in the US. So we called this show In the Fields of the North, obviously, because if you're in Mexico, North is in the US. And we used the wall in the creative way that other Mexican and border artists have done. That is thinking if we can't get rid of it, well, let's at least make it serve the needs of the people. Now, many of the photographs that we put on the wall in Tijuana are part of a traveling exhibition. They're currently being shown in the Museum of the History of Tijuana. And because we can't get into museums these days, the museum has produced a video in which it kind of walks around through the museum and shows you the photographs on the wall. So if you're interested, I can send you the URL for the website where you can see this. And these photographs, they show the reality of exploitation. That is, they show how hard people work and their communities in poverty. But they also show the culture of indigenous communities and how people organize for change. That is, the culture of resistance, how we change social reality. So I want to talk about these photographs for a minute and what their purpose is. Alexander Rodchenko, who was a photographer in Moscow in the 1920s, he said, "We must take photographs from every angle but the navel." He and his fellow photographers pioneered the use of extreme angles and close-ups as a way to shake the viewer's perspective and to liberate us from complacency. So this photograph here uses Rodchenko's idea of using a low angle to make the worker big and important, and at the same time to show how it is that Beatriz here is doing this work of weeding. Bertolt Brecht, the playwright, said that drama and art in general should stimulate people to question social reality in a critical way. That is, not just tell stories or romanticize things. In fact, Brecht thought that most art puts people to sleep, and he wanted to wake people up. Nacho Lopez, who was the famous Mexican photojournalist of the 50s, said that photography was not meant as art to adorn walls, but rather to make obvious the ancestral cruelty of man against man. Now, what all of these artists have in common is that they viewed themselves as participants in the world, not as just abstract or sort of documenters from the outside who would sort of parachute in and take pictures or write something and then leave, but to participate in the social movements of the world in which they live. And I do too. That's how I look at it. I use a method that combines photographs with interviews and personal histories. And I call this combination the reality check. That is the documentation of social reality. It is documentation with a purpose, not just as an outside observer. And documenting social reality is part of the movement for social change. So when you take a picture, or when I take a picture like this one here, of farm workers leaving a field of blueberries in McFarland in the San Joaquin Valley, the purpose of it is not just to show what it is that workers are doing and sort of carry their message to the rest of the world, that is part of it, but it is also so that we can look at how they organize and how they act, the idea of this very direct action that they are taking in an effort to sort of change their conditions rather than just simply following a legal process or simply sitting at work and kind of taking it. When I began to work as a photographer and a writer, documenting the lives of migrants and farm workers, I took with me that perspective of my previous work as a union organizer. So carrying a camera for me is a way to organize for social and racial justice, which are the same goals that I had as an organizer. So for me, photography is a cooperative project. When I went to take this photograph of the strike in the labor camp at Sakuma Farms in Washington State, it was in cooperation with the workers there who had just organized Familias Unidas por la Justicia. And in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about what happened there with the creation of this new union. So today I'm talking with you as an artist, that is a writer and a photographer, and also as an organizer. And the thread running through this work is the idea that we are trying to change the way people think. Social change comes about when people change the way they understand the world and then act on it. And sometimes this happens in a house meeting, and sometimes on a picket line, and sometimes our understanding grows because we read a book or we see a photograph that makes us think. And all of these, in my way of thinking, are part of organizing. So today, Washington State's farm worker communities are in upheaval. On the coast, a 4-year struggle has won an agreement for the country's newest union, this one I was just talking about, Familias Unidas por la Justicia. In central Washington, workers who've been living in agricultural valleys for decades are in danger of displacement by the mushrooming recruitment of guest workers, workers on contract from Mexico, who themselves face difficult work and living conditions, and especially now with the virus. So in photographs and narratives, I try to paint a picture of this life in the fields today. This is a story of the food we eat. More berries and apples, for instance, come from Washington's fields than from any other state in any other part either of Mexico or the US. And yet most of us are ignorant about the lives of the people who bring this fruit to our table. These photographs are intended to help give us an appreciation of the thirst for social justice among the people whose sacrifice it takes. They show the modern history of farm labor organizing, of people challenging the barriers of discrimination against indigenous and sexual identities, and of lives of hard work and poverty. So today, I want to hear the voices of the people who work in the fields and those leading these struggles for justice. But before we get into the story of Familias Unidas por la Justicia and the strike at Sakuma Farms, I want to pose some simple questions. What is it that tells us what we think about farm workers? What are our ideas about who farm workers are? Here, for instance, we have a family of farm workers living all in one room. You can see the beds with the sheets there. And the idea of this photograph is to make us think about the question of privacy, for instance, how these young women who are just reaching adulthood have, the space that they need to have a private life of their own in a situation in which people are living like this. And of course, in an era in which we have the spread of the virus, the living conditions that this dramatizes, in other words, people, because of lack of income, basically, poverty, low wages, being forced to live in very small spaces, large families and multiple families in small spaces. But I think, who are farm workers after all? Um, you know, is this a photograph of a farm worker? Clearly it is, right? This is Lorena, who is doing the work. She's picking blueberries. But what about these people? Are these people farm workers? What do you think? The Guelaguetza in Fresno, who is it that we think dances in the Guelaguetza, which after all is a dance festival of people coming from Oaxaca to California? Or these dancers here in the library. This is the library in the small farm worker town of Hollister in California. And here are Triqui women who are dancing in a cultural event at the library. But let me ask you, when these dancers take off their wonderful huipiles and their beautiful costumes, what do they look like? And what's even more important, what do they do? What work do they do? Are they farm workers? How do we know? Here's another way of looking at it. Here are these two young guys. What do we think about them, right? Well, these are two young men sitting in the rows of a field of raspberries in Washington State, up near the border with Canada. And the first thing we can see here is that they are white. They are not Mexican.
There you are.
They're what? So the question is then, are they farm workers? After all, our whole image in our mind of who farm workers are is based on people being people of color, especially Mexicans, especially Latinos. But if they are obviously having lunch after working in the rows here, doing the work, are they farm workers? The question is, since we know that most farm workers are people of color, are people farm workers because of their color or because of the work they do? Is farm work an identity or is it a job? It's an important question because farm workers both in California and Washington, in fact, throughout the United States, have almost always been people of color. They've almost always been migrants from other countries as well, too. In fact, if we took a look at the agricultural labor population of the world, we would see that the overwhelming bulk of agricultural labor, in other words, wage labor in agriculture, are people who are migrants. So another question here. These are farm workers in the field. Where did these workers here come from? Obviously, Estela Ramirez, being a Zapoteca, came from Oaxaca. And here we have Hieronima Alvarez picking strawberries in Santa Maria in California. Same thing, Mixtecos, Zapotecos, Triquis. Most farm workers in California, first of all, come from Mexico and increasingly come from Oaxaca and the states of the South. On the coast where most blueberries and raspberries come from, the two languages you're most likely to hear if you listen to berry workers talking with each other are Mixteco and Triqui. And in fact, this is not just true of the Pacific coast of the US, it is true of the Pacific coast of Mexico as well, too. If you go into the strawberry and tomato fields of Baja California or Sinaloa, what languages are we going to hear people speaking in the field? Same ones, Mixteco, Triqui, overwhelmingly, Zapoteco, and some others. Tens of thousands of people have left Oaxaca to come to work, both in northern Mexico and of course in the US. So why? Well, here's one why. This is Zacarias Salazar plowing his cornfield behind oxen. I'm not trying to say that this is that hand plowing with animals is the main method of agriculture in Oaxaca. I'm just trying to dramatize the fact that that making a living as a farmer in Oaxaca is a very difficult proposition for people, and that people oftentimes are doing it in a way that is not going to even satisfy their own needs for food, let alone produce enough for them to be able to sell. And of course, we could go into the whole question of NAFTA and trade agreements and what happened to corn in Mexico, which of course is the crop that he is trying to grow here after the border was opened and US corporations began dumping millions of tons of corn onto the Mexican market. Here's the mother of a friend of mine, Centolia Maldonado, cooking tortillas on a wood fire at home. So these photographs, these two photographs in particular, they give us some idea that people's life is hard and of why this man or woman, or actually more likely their kids, might want to come up to the border looking for work or cross it into the US. Was this always where farm workers came from? 80 years ago, many, if not most, farm workers on the Pacific coast of the US came from the Philippines. They came from Garcia Hernandez, for instance, where these rice farmers live, or from the banana plantations on Mindanao. The first unions for farm workers in Washington state were started by Filipinos, first in the CIO, which was the Radical Industrial Union Federation of the 30s, and later in Local 37 of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. It's no accident that at the same time, the farm workers from the Philippines were organizing their first unions in Washington and California in the 1930s. Back in the Philippines, workers were also organizing their first unions in agriculture and industry as well. Some of the organizers of that time, like Larry Idleong here, organized farm workers all along the coast, Washington, California, and he and the Filipinos of that era belonged to the International Longshore and Warehouse Union when they worked in Alaska in the salmon canneries in the summer. And then in the 1950s, they organized another union that was called the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. And they were the workers in the union that started the Great Grape Strike in 1965 in Delano, which is when the United Farm Workers Union was formed. If you see that movie about Cesar Chavez, it tells you the story at the beginning of that strike, although it doesn't really give, I don't think, proper credit to the Filipino workers who were the ones who actually did the first organizing and striking. In any case, the history of unions among farm workers is a long one. In Washington state, California, both, Baja California as well too. And that history is all connected. When people in Washington state heard about the grape strike in Delano, for instance, in '65, and the formation of the United Farm Workers, they began to organize. And the first place they did that was at a huge winery called Chateau Saint Michel. This struggle went on for many years. And finally, in the mid-1980s, organizers came from the Rainbow Coalition, which was the organization started by Reverend Jesse Jackson when he was running for president, and Jobs with Justice, which was sort of a network of unions and activists interested in sort of more direct action and organizing in our labor movement in the US. And with those workers, they launched a boycott that won a contract finally for the workers at that winery. And the main organizer in that effort was a young woman from a farm worker family, originally from Guanajuato actually, who then settled down in Bellingham in Washington state, a woman named Rosalinda Guillen. And to Rosalinda, winning this contract at Chateau Saint Michel was important, but she says it wasn't justice all by itself. So here's what she said about it. She said, I don't think I can win a union contract like Chateau Saint Michel and then I'm done. That's just barely touching the surface. If you're an organizer, the longer you do it, the more you're digging into the fundamental causes of the oppression your people are under. Because you know what? Those workers are still in a fight. They're fighting every day for their existence. Maybe it's easier because of that contract, but our goal should be fundamental change. After that contract was signed, and here's Rosalinda talking to some workers in the next big organizing event that happened up there. After the contract was signed with the winery, Rosalinda was brought by the United Farm Workers to California and she was an organizer in the big campaign to organize strawberry workers in Watsonville at the end of the 1990s. And then she became the UFW's political organizer responsible for legislation in Sacramento. She took one of the ideas that they had pioneered at Chateau Saint-Michel of a kind of forced arbitration of union contracts where workers have voted for the union, and she got the legislature in California to put it into the law. And it is the best labor law for farm workers that we have anywhere in the United States. In fact, I would say it's better than Mexico, because Mexico, farm workers in Mexico are left out of labor legislation just the way they were in the United States. Afterwards, Rosalinda decided to go back home to Washington. She left the UFW, and in Bellingham, she started another organization that was called Community to Community. And that became so active and well known that whenever farm workers in Washington decided to fight against abuse or get better wages or conditions, that was the first organization they would call. And that's what happened in 2013. But again, before we get there, I want to give you some idea of what the work is like. And here I want to give you the words of a young woman I talked with in Wapato in Washington 3 years ago, because it gives us a sense of why it is that people want to organize. I talked with Eva Chavez here, a farm worker who went back to school and got an AA degree, an associate degree. And here's how she describes her work life. She says, "Sometimes I'd barely make it home because I was so tired. Coming back from work was dangerous." She was picking apples. "Coming back from work was dangerous if the ranch was too far from home. You're so tired, and sometimes you sleep on the road and you could have an accident. 2 or 3 times, I'd just park outside my house and sleep in the car. I didn't even want to go inside." She said, "When I got good at the work, I could make good money, but I would have to kill myself to do it. I would have to try to focus on the wages and not on the pain. It was hard to get motivated and to wake up every morning. You're so tired from the day before, but it doesn't matter. You have to wake up." She goes on to talk about women. She says, "Women who are married and have kids wake up way earlier than their husband. They prepare the food, work sometimes the same as the husband. Then they come home and cook for the husband and the kids. They fix the house, they do the laundry, they help the kids. It is very tough. I think about how much damage farm workers are doing to their bodies. Some take a lot of pills or drink, 1 or 2 Red Bulls or Monsters a day. Those things damage your body, but they are too exhausted. You got to be very careful with the money you make because it's not enough. And then when farm workers do speak up, the owners of the ranches say they don't have any money. We have to work holidays and we don't get paid extra. If we get sick, they're not going to give you sick days. If you're pregnant, they're not going to give you maternity leave. We put our lives out there in the fields for a job and we will never get that time back." And then she goes on and talks about sexual abuse at work. She said, "There was a big issue with the Evans Fruit Company where they had a mayordomo, a foreman, who raped women. So on top of working hard, on top of not earning enough, on top of not getting benefits, women still have to handle these situations which are not right. Women wear loose clothes and they cover their faces. They don't want to show anything, so they won't be seen as objects. I mean, we shouldn't be doing that. Why do we have to do that? Women are not sexual objects. I could never say that I was gay in the fields. There are some men who are just so screwed up that they think, oh, she's gay because she hasn't found a good man like me. No, that's who I am, and they cannot respect that. It's not that I don't want to talk about my sexuality, but sometimes people are just so close-minded that they cannot understand. And sometimes there are people who have this devil thinking, oh, that you're gay, and I'm going to make you a woman." So in 2013, workers protested those low wages and bad conditions at a berry ranch near Barrington called Sakuma Farms. They met with managers and they asked for a wage raise, and the leader of that effort was fired because the workers were living in the labor camp. Getting fired also meant getting kicked out of the camp. And for Federico, the fired worker who'd come all the way from California, losing a place to live and a job at the same time put him in a desperate situation. So the rest of the workers stopped work to get his job back. So this Rosario Ventura, who was another one of those workers at that ranch there who'd come up from California, and she talks about what it was like. She said, I've always lived in the labor camp during the picking season. We decided to continue living in California and we never moved to Washington permanently. Now, where she lived in California, Madera and Bellingham is over 1,000 miles away. It's a long ways from one to the other. In the summer, we go to Washington. Then when the work runs out, we come back to Madera. We go every season. When we go to Washington, we have to rent someplace in Madera to store our belongings, like our clothes. And then when we return, we have to search for a new home again. When we're in Washington, we have to save for the winter season because there's no work until April. The trip to Washington is expensive, about $250 in gas and food. If we don't have enough money, we have to ask for a loan. That's what we normally do, since by then we've used up what we saved from the previous year. The strike started when company fired Federico. We wanted Sakuma to raise the piece rate and the company refused. They told us if we want to work, work, and if not, get out. Then they accused Federico of starting a protest. I went to his cabin to kick him out of the camp. That's when we stopped work to get his job back. Then she goes on to talk about what it was like in the camp. She said, we were also upset about the conditions in the labor camp. The mattress they gave us was torn and dirty, and the wire was coming out. This is Felimon, who was his room in the camp was right next door to where Rosario and her family were staying, and you can see that mattress that she's talking about. We're accustomed to sleeping with the children, but the bed was so small we couldn't even all fit on it. There were cockroaches and rats. The roof leaked when it rained. They just put bags in the holes and it still leaked. All my children's clothes were wet. The county inspector would come and check the cabin, but the company man in charge of the camp told me if the inspector comes, don't say anything or you will have a lot of problems. They always try to make us afraid to speak up. If you ask for another 5 cents, they fire you. They threatened to remove us from the camp because of the strikes, and then they said they'd fire us. They are always threatening us. They fired Ramon, who was the leader of the strike in the union, because he talked to them. But thank God he had the courage to speak out. So the workers organized themselves. But one of the biggest problems that they had was that Sakuma Farms had brought in 78 workers from Mexico on H-2A visas. That wasn't enough to do all the work, but the strikers thought, if it's 78 this year, how do we know that they won't replace all of us next year? And that's exactly what the company tried to do. In this program, H-2A, growers recruit workers in Mexico and they bring them to the US with temporary visas. Workers can't bring their families and they can only stay as long as the work lasts. When it's over, they have to go back to Mexico. And if they don't work fast enough or they try to organize a union, they get fired. And if they're fired, they lose the visa, they're deported, and then they're blacklisted. So H-2A workers are very vulnerable, which makes them very attractive to growers. Under the law, the company can't hire H-2A workers if there are local people who want to do the work. So to get around this, after the season of the first strike was over, Sakuma Farms sent letters to all of its longtime workers. And remember, these longtime workers are themselves immigrants also. They are immigrants who are already living in the United States, mostly people without papers from Oaxaca, Mixtecos, and Triquis in the case of Sakuma Farms. So to get around this, after the season of the first strike was over, Sakuma Farms sent letters to all of its longtime workers saying they were fired. Then it turned around and told the government that it needed to bring in almost 500 H-2A workers because it didn't have any local workers anymore. Strikers developed a relationship with the Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales, an organization of indigenous people with chapters in Oaxaca, Baja California, and California. Almost all the workers were from Oaxaca, so they knew who this organization was. And then FIOB's binational coordinator, Bernardo Ramirez, who we see right here, talking to Ramon, went to Burlington and he spent a week there helping the strikers to get organized. To defeat the firings in H-2A and Sakuma's H-2A application, the strikers decided to get everyone to sign letters saying they were ready to work. So the Frente Indígena, which had chapters in Madera and Santa Maria, which is where the workers who lived in California were, it held meetings and collected the letters from Sakuma workers who lived in California. This, by the way, is Sarai Martinez, a Zapoteca from Oaxaca, who was just recently became the head of the Frente Indígena in California and Mexico. So the letters were turned into the Department of Labor, and here she is with one of the strikers, and then with people from our local labor council and a supporting priest. And they turned those into the Department of Labor in San Francisco. Even though the regulations aren't enforced most of the time, there was so much publicity that the government couldn't ignore it. When the company realized that their application might get turned down, they withdrew it. But of course, then they still needed workers because the harvest was about to start. So Sakuma Farms had to rehire the strikers, and that was the key battle that meant that the workers were going to be successful in organizing their union. If they'd lost that battle, in other words, if they had been replaced by contract workers from Mexico, those strikers would have lost their jobs, the union would have been destroyed, and they would never have been able to get a contract. The strikers got students and other workers to help them by boycotting the company's main customers, Driscoll Berries. Driscoll, by the way, is the biggest grower of berries in Mexico as well, too, with big farms in Baja California and in Jalisco. In fact, Driscoll's is the largest berry company in the world. And that boycott worked, just like it worked in the 1960s with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers during the big grape strike and boycott. You know, Cesar Chavez said that you only have to cut a company's sales by 5% to make them talk, and the boycott did that. The new union got help from the Longshoremen's Union, research to know how to put pressure on Driscoll's, and longshoremen then refused to load berries onto the cruise ships that docked in Seattle. The strikers drove from the Canadian border all the way to Tijuana and organized student boycott committees on the coast all the way. Driscoll's was putting millions of dollars into a new marketing plan, and that's why you see so much of their produce in the supermarkets with those fancy labels, and not just in the US, but in Mexico now too. The boycott hit them when they were vulnerable, so Driscoll's put pressure on Sakuma, and finally Sakuma Farms agreed to an election so that the workers could show by voting that they supported the union. And that new union had to invent a legal process because there's no farm worker law in the United States which gives workers the right to organize a union, and there's no statewide law in Washington state. Workers were excluded from the main labor legislation in the US in the 1930s because growers in the Southwest and the South didn't want African American and Mexican farm workers covered by any kind of labor law. The retired head of the National Labor Relations Board conducted the election even though the workers weren't covered by the law, and the State Labor Council counted the ballots. And here we see the head of the State Labor Federation supporting these workers. Why did the workers win? Because for 4 years, they had work stoppages, small strikes in the fields to force wages up. This is something that workers didn't have to have any organizer come and tell them about or talk about, because this was some part of the culture that they had brought with them from Mexico, the idea of direct action out there in the fields. They learned how to use collective action at work then to put pressure on this enormous corporation like Driscoll's by combining it with the boycott. Workers organized a democratic organization that they controlled themselves, and they found allies like the Brown Berets here, like the Labor Council, like the priest, who helped them to put pressure on. I went to the meetings where workers discussed what was in the contract and voted to accept what had been negotiated. And after the meeting, I talked with one of their leaders, Tomas Ramon, and this is how he described what the contract meant to him. And Tomas is a tricky worker from Oaxaca. So Tomas says, I think the contract is a beautiful thing. Tomorrow we'll sign it with Sakuma. Things won't be the same as they were before. The company didn't have any way out because people were strongly supporting the union and the strikes and the work stoppages. We stayed very united, and that's why we won. Our supporters in other places, like the students and other unions, they were also important. And now we're a recognized union, we'll have more rights and the wages will be better. I think people are really happy about it. The wages are the most important thing. With the contract, they'll be paying a little higher than in the past years, and no grower in this part of Washington is paying higher than $12 an hour, and now ours will be higher. My wife and I have worked for Sakuma for 6 years, and now we'll work with more dignity. And if we work 10 or 12 hours, we'll have a little more to show for it. We'll work with more respect, and respect is good, isn't it? The next day, the workers who'd led this effort sat down with the company manager, Danny Whedon here, and they signed the contract. Here's the union's president on the right, Ramon Torres, watching him sign it. Ramon also talked about what that new contract meant and what kind of union it is that workers are fighting for here. Ramon says, union leaders should be workers themselves. The decision should be made by the workers. No one should make more than a worker at work. We don't want rich people or money in the bank. We don't want rich unions and poor workers. We've always felt that we are invisible people. We are not just farm workers. We are part of the community. We have children. We pay taxes and Medi-Cal, even though we can't get the benefits because we don't have papers. We know the contract will change our lives now. If we make a little more, our children will have other possibilities. It's not that we want to take them out of the fields, but we want them to have the opportunities that other children have. So the union and that contract are important because there are basic decisions being made about what kind of future farm workers are going to have in Washington state. In the last few years, growers have begun bringing thousands of workers into Washington under the H-2A program. One of those workers was Ernesto Silva, who collapsed and died in a field in Sumas near the Canadian border 3 years ago. His co-workers stopped work to protest his death and to demand better conditions at the ranch. The new union, Familias Unidas, came out to help them, but then they lost the visa. Remember, they only have the visa so long as they're working for the company that contracted with them. Their permission to stay in the US, and they had to go back to Mexico. In effect, they were deported for stopping work. And here's what one of those workers told me. Jonathan Murillo, he says, I could see that Ernesto, he's talking about why Ernesto died. He said, I could see that he wasn't feeling well and he asked to leave work. And this is important because this is the reality of the conditions that people face when they go to the US to work. And in Mexico, there are a lot of illusions among people about what kinds of conditions and how good it might be to be able to go to the US and work with one of these visas. So he says, I could see that Ernesto wasn't feeling well and he asked to leave work. They wouldn't give him permission. He went back to the barracks to rest. The supervisor, Javier, went and got him out and forced him to go back to work. And afterwards, he continued to feel bad. He had to pay somebody to take him to the clinic. And when he got to the clinic, he was feeling really bad. And then he died. From the way I knew him, he was a young man, a healthy man. From the time we came from Mexico to California, there was never enough to eat. And often the food was bad. Some of the food was actually thrown out, but they took money for it out of our checks anyway. They took out money for medical care, but we never got any of that either. Some of the workers protested in California, and then the company sent them back to Mexico. There were many reasons why we were upset. When we got to Sumas, it was the same as it was when we were working in California. There was a lot of pressure put on us to work, but what actually pushed us to act was what happened to Ernesto when he got sick and there was no help for him. We wanted to talk with the company to reach an agreement, but the company wasn't willing to listen to us. So many of us decided that we weren't going to work until there was a solution. The contractor who recruited us said that they'd call the migra and the police. So they fired us and they forced us out into the road in front of the farm. That company, which is called Sarbanon Farms, they were fined $149,800 by Washington's Department of Labor and Industry, not because Ernesto died, but for not providing required breaks and meal periods. And then a judge came and cut that fine in half. Rosalinda told a protest rally, she said, we completely reject the idea that Silva's life was worth $75,000. No amount of money can pay for the life of a farm worker. The state of Washington refused to fine the company over the death of Ernesto Silva and over the firing of the workers who had gone on strike. The number of workers recruited like Ernesto Silva reached 250,000 last year. 1/3 of all the farm workers in Washington state are now H-2A contract workers recruited here in Mexico. Most are recruited by a labor contractor called the Washington Farm Labor Association. Last year, that association got the US government, the Department of Labor, to slash the wages for H-2A workers by $6 an hour in order to increase the profits for growers. Prefabricated barracks, like the ones you see in the background here, are appearing in orchards miles away from the nearest town. And inside, these H-2A workers sleep in bunk beds, 4 to a room, and cook in a common kitchen. Now, this has become a big controversy in Washington state now, because when workers are sleeping on bunk beds, 4 people to a room, it's impossible for people to maintain that social distance of 6 feet from each other. And as a result, the coronavirus is starting to spread in those barracks. In fact, not starting to spread, it was one of the first places that it appeared in Washington state back in March and April of this year. Some of the barracks are ringed by a chain link fence chopped by barbed wire. Since the workers come up from Mexico on company buses, they have no cars. And if they want to go into town, they depend on the grower to provide transportation. Familias Unidas helps those workers to organize and at the same time fights against the expansion of the program. Last year, a group of workers at the King Fuji Ranch contacted that union, and the union sent Ramon Torres and Edgar Franks to talk with them. Edgar said it was freezing and they couldn't feel their hands or their feet. This was when they were working in January and February. Some workers had pains in their arms and hands, but they were afraid to go to the doctor because they might get written up, and with 3 written warnings, they'd be fired. And of course, remember, being fired means being deported. The company required them to thin 12 to 15 sections a day, which is a big area of land, which the workers said was impossible. This labor contractor has a long relationship with a company that recruits these workers in Mexico, which is called CSI Visa Processing. And CSI boasts that it is the largest recruiter of H-2A workers in Mexico, with 10 offices, including in Guanajuato, throughout Mexico, and last year recruited 30,000 workers. Workers who are recruited by this company, they have to sign a form in which they acknowledge that their employer can fire them for inadequate performance, meaning working too slow, in which case they will have to return to Mexico. And then its website warns workers, CSI shares candidate records with companies to select whomever they see fit. What this really means is, and workers can understand this very well, is that there's a blacklist, that if they get deported and if they make trouble, they won't be rehired for the following season. Cases like these convince Washington state the legislature to pass a bill with greater protections for H-2A workers. But then when the controversy started about these bunk beds and workers sleeping so close together, the state said that having those conditions was okay because it would cost the companies too much money in order to be able to revamp their housing and expand their housing so that workers weren't crowded so close together. Now there's a danger that Congress is going to pass a law on a federal level that expands the H-2A program. And if it passes, I think that about half of all the farm workers in the US, and there are about 2.5 million farm workers in the US, so about half of them, that is 1.25 million people, would be H-2A workers within a decade. So the choice here is between the union contract and what that represents, and stability for farm workers and the union and their communities here, or this program that allows workers to be treated as Honesto was and the Sarbanan workers were, and that sees farm workers as disposable. So this is what Rosalinda Guillen says our choice really is. Rosalinda says, in the United States, the immigration system is fed by the displacement of farmers who were landowners in Mexico and Central America. Because of the trade agreements that started in 1994 with NAFTA, they couldn't survive and they moved north. And now many of them are sitting in those detention centers. A lot of them have been farmers for generations. They know how to grow food with no chemicals and how to conserve water or how to take care of the land. We desperately need to find a way to change our food system and to use the knowledge of these family farmers who are coming here before they lose it. You cannot look at producing food simply for the profit that it's going to make, and that's where we are right now. When the production of food is based on how much money a corporation can make from it and from what they're growing, then farm workers become a liability. We are a cost in their financial statements. In the capitalist system, she says, we are disposable and we are easily replaceable. This guest worker program is a good example. You bring people in and you ship them out and you make money off of them. And it's time to end that. We're human beings and we're part of the community. We eat too, like everybody else. Cesar said it. We can't afford the very food we grow. A farm worker can't afford the price for fresh organic carrots, and they grow them. It's totally off balance. It's unsafe, it's unsustainable, inhumane, and unhealthy for everybody, for people, for animals, for the earth. And farm workers are the first ones to feel that unhealthy situation. We have to be the first ones to speak out because we're the first ones to die. The average lifespan of a farm worker is 49 years, 2 years up from what it was in the year 2000. So yeah, hooray, we're up to 49. And that was before the virus. So thank you for listening and looking at these images. And if you have questions or things that you want to say yourself, I guess now is the time to do that.
Well, David, thank you for a very interesting talk and some fabulous, fabulous photography. Let me show people the email address they need to use in order to send questions your way. global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And give people a few minutes to compose their questions and send it our way. Let me pose a first question. Today, farm workers are facing not only all of the usual obstacles and hardships that you described, they're also facing the coronavirus and now the smoke from the wildfires of the Pacific coast. Can you say a word about that?
Sure. Well, here in California, the rate of infection of COVID infection in the 7 rural counties of the San Joaquin Valley, which is the agricultural heartland, not just of California, the whole United States, basically, is much, much higher than it is in urban areas. And the reason for that is because the virus has become concentrated among people who either work in the fields or work in the packing sheds. This is not just unique to farm workers. The same situation basically exists for people who work in meatpacking plants as well too. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, for the packing shed workers and for meatpacking plant workers, the conditions of work themselves are much more dangerous during a period of the virus because workers work essentially next to conveyor belts on lines, essentially disassembly lines where they're sorting lines. And when it is possible for growers to space workers out so that they're not as close to each other while they're working. But if growers do that, then the line has to slow down because you can't have as many people working at one time, and therefore the line has to slow down so that those workers who are there can do the work that is passing in front of them. That has, whether growers are willing to do this or not, is not just a question. Well, first of all, there's really basically no government enforcement that forces vegetable companies and meat companies to do this. There's no regulation on the books really that basically corresponds to working conditions with the virus. There are these recommendations for social distancing. There are recommendations for mask wearing and protective equipment, but they don't have yet the force of law. And of course, with the Trump administration controlling the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, there's not likely to be any kind of enforceable federal regulation. Some states, like Washington State, did try to impose or try to formulate under pressure from the Familias Unidas and United Farm Workers Union, did try to propose some degree of regulation. However, as we saw in the case of the regulation around the bunk beds, when the growers complained that it was going to cost them millions and millions of dollars to build new barracks so that workers could sleep further apart, the state caved in and gave the growers an exemption on that. In terms of working conditions inside the sheds, for instance, the best enforcement has come when workers have been able to organize themselves and force the companies to provide safer working conditions. This actually happened in central Washington in the apple packing sheds in the Yakima Valley, where workers began walking out on strike in shed after shed after shed, demanding two things. One is safer conditions at work, and the other one was sort of hazard pay to compensate them for having to go to work under these conditions. You know, it's important to say that, you know, the companies were not telling workers what was going on with the virus. Workers were learning about the rate of infection by talking with each other. This also happened in California at a big pistachio packing company called Primex, where workers were learning about people sort of suddenly not showing up for work any longer by talking with each other in the bathroom. The company was not only not telling them what was happening, the company was actually trying to keep them from speaking with each other to learn what the real conditions were, and they walked out on strike in Primex too. In Washington State, workers were able to force the companies into some concessions around more safe conditions, slowing the line speed. At Primex in California, the company basically fired all the workers who were leading the protests about it. And there is no protection, no effective protection for workers fired under those circumstances. So it's not just that the state government in California, we have our own OSHA in California, Cal OSHA, has no inspectors who are going out to the packing sheds and to the fields and trying to enforce safer conditions. It's also that when workers take the risk upon themselves to organize and to try and force those companies to do that, then companies are able to retaliate and fire workers from their jobs. That means that workers often put up with unsafe conditions. And that's a very dangerous thing during a pandemic, because what it really means is that if somebody is sick, that workers are going to be afraid to speak up or to require safe conditions or the isolation of those workers. Now, the other part of this is the question of poverty, because let's say that somebody in a crew picking blueberries does get sick. What is this worker supposed to do? It's not just a question of what the rights are of the workers around them to safer conditions and their fear of getting fired, but people who are who get sick at work, farm workers who get sick at work, really have no option for self-isolation. We saw the living conditions of that family, remember, with all the bunk beds in that room there? Those are the conditions in which workers are living as just sort of normal circumstances, a lot of workers. So a person who gets sick at work, first of all, is going to come home and to run the risk of infecting other people in their family, people in other families living in those same crowded conditions. So the living conditions that are enforced by poverty are also leading to the spread of the virus. And there, it's a question of what is the alternative? You know, if somebody who gets sick picking blueberries and they stop work, what is the family going to do to pay the rent? It's not just that the worker himself cannot, herself or himself cannot isolate themselves. In other words, there's no place to go. There's no money to go and rent a motel room and stay in the motel room for 14 days. But it's also that by not working, you put your family at risk of eviction, for instance, or not having enough money to buy food. So those conditions of poverty also are leading to the spread of the virus. And finally, the third factor is the transportation to and from the fields. Workers often go to and from the fields, for instance, in cars. In farm worker towns, it's very common to have people who are called raiteros. In other words, a person with a car. And for $5, that person is willing to give somebody a ride to and from work, from the pickup place and drop them off again. And so the raitero fills the car with as many people as possible. And again, people traveling to and from work in those crowded conditions, again, you have the danger of contamination. There are growers who provide transportation themselves, say from a central point like a packing shed out to the fields and back in a bus. But there again, the question is, okay, if it's a responsible grower, that grower might, for instance, only have one worker on each bench seat in a bus and have them spaced out sort of diagonally so that they weren't sitting directly in front or behind each other. I've seen pictures of that, and I know that there are growers who do that, but there are also other growers who just simply want to fill up the bus and don't care. So all of those conditions are the ones that are leading to this spike in coronavirus infections in rural areas. Some people are talking about it as though that they are saying, well, this is a spike among Latino people. And that's true, but we have to take a look at what this means and sort of unpack that a little bit, because the virus doesn't know and doesn't care whether you're white or Latino or Black or anything else. A human body is a human body. So it doesn't have a preference for infecting Latino people. It is the concentration of Mexicans in those conditions, in those jobs, which is making them vulnerable. And therefore, obviously, the rate of infection among Mexican people in Tulare County or in Fresno is going to be much higher than it might be among, well, certainly among upper middle class white people living in Marin County. So, these are some of the factors that are causing this spike in virus. But I just want to, reiterate here that workers are not passive in the face of this. First of all, they're not ignorant. It's not that people don't understand what's going on. They understand better than anybody else. The question is, what can people and what are people doing about it? And I think farm workers are showing, like meatpacking workers have as well too, a record here of self-organization and willingness to take action where they can at work in order to ensure safer conditions for themselves. And that, I think, is what is going to make workers safer or not safer. I don't think the government's going to come in and save anybody. And I don't think having more and more studies, right now we have a sort of a plethora of studies in California about, the situation of farm workers and farm workers getting sick. And I don't think that studying people is going to make a damn bit of difference, to be honest. I think it is the question of whether people are going to be able to organize and whether the rest of the community is going to support workers when they do that, that is going to provide some safety and some pressure to lower the infection rate.
We have a question here that has come in. Let me share it with you from Joe Ham. Do the workers speak Spanish as well as their indigenous languages?
Overwhelmingly, yes, they do. There are people coming to the US, especially from very remote towns in Oaxaca, who are sometimes coming, who are only fluent in the language of their community. Usually, in terms of people coming to the US, it's usually people who are very old, who are in that situation. And because most migration is migration people looking for work, the rate of migration among older people isn't as great as it is among people of working age. So there are people who are coming who are monolingual in Mixteco or Triqui and Zapoteco. And in fact, organizations like the Frente Indígena have a history of advocating for language rights for monolingual speakers of indigenous languages. One of the first big battles that the Frente Indígena fought in California in the early 1990s was for the right of Mixteco speakers and Triqui speakers to have translation services in courts, because there were a couple of celebrated cases in which young men were convicted of crimes who were clearly not guilty of them, but simply did not have the ability to participate in their own defense. And so they won this right in the California court system, and we now have certified, in fact, the current head of the Frente Indígena, the binational coordinator, Odilia Romero in Los Angeles, is a certified court interpreter in Zapoteco. So, those are very important rights, and especially when it comes to the ability of people to understand their rights as workers, as farm workers. California Rural Legal Assistance has a long partnership with the Frente Indígena, in which the Frente Indígena encourages people to go to work for California Rural Legal Assistance as community outreach workers, so that they can go out to the fields and explain to workers what their labor rights in their languages, Mixteco and Zapoteco and so forth. But especially among young people, I would say, are not just bilingual in their indigenous language in Spanish. I would say most young people of high school age and younger are trilingual, because they have to function in English in school. Language is often, Spanish is often the language that kids and young people are speaking amongst each other while they're out there playing or hanging out. And then the indigenous language is the one that the family insists on speaking at home, so the kids don't lose their culture.
Of course, when there isn't a common language, that makes organizing all the more difficult.
It can, but the flip side of that, Cliff, is that people coming from, in farm labor especially, it's very common to find a crew of workers who are mostly related to each other and mostly coming from the same town, which means that people already have their own internal self-organization. And so that when people decide collectively to do something like to stop work or to protest, they find it very easy in some ways to do that, or because they have a collective decision-making process that already exists and that they use for other purposes. So sometimes organizing happens very quickly among people from indigenous communities in Mexico. But when you actually have, when you have a company with a bunch of different crews and people are mixed, where you have some crews of people who have been living in the US for 25 years, other crews who are Filipinos, some crews who are Mexican, it's true. Getting people together and crossing those barriers of language and nationality, that can be an obstacle for sure.
When there are people who've come from the same community, frequently they form what are called hometown associations.
That's right.
And in addition to sending remittances back to their family, they will sometimes send collective remittances for some community project.
That's right. That's true.
Yeah. I'm looking at the gallery view of people who are on the Zoom call. If there's anyone who has a question or comment they would like to put into the discussion, open up your camera, your video, so I can see you, and wave your hand and I'll call on you. Okay, here's Mitsulu first, and then David Barkin. Mitsulu first.
Oh, hi, Cliff and David. Thank you so much. And thanks for mentioning the Filipino workers, by the way. I put my questions in the chat. There was two. One is about support from African-American workers, and the other is about the fact that the new NAFTA stipulates that Mexican workers should have the right to form independent unions, but I take it that doesn't apply to Mexican workers in the US, and just wonder what the US labor folks and the Democrats who pushed for that in the new NAFTA have to say, if anything, about this.
Well, it's good to see you, Major.
Good to see you.
Well, As far as support from African American people for the struggle of farm workers generally, I think that there's been a lot of support for it, going way back. Remember that the grape strike, 1965, took place at the height of the civil rights movement in the South. In fact, there were some people who had gone south and worked in voter registration drives in the South, who then went to Delano and became part of the first effort to organize the strike there. So there was a historic connection and feeling of comradeship between between those struggles. There aren't very many African American workers working as farm workers in the fields in California and on the West Coast. That's different on the East Coast. On the East Coast, there are still significant numbers of African American workers in states like South Carolina and Florida. On the West Coast, very few. So the relationships of support and solidarity, I think, took place mostly when farm workers left Delano and left the valley and went to cities to try to get support for the strike, for the boycott, and for their efforts generally. One of the first places that people would go would be to churches, and African American churches were very welcoming to workers and did what they could, whether it was in terms of supporting consumer boycotts or donating money and supplies. And then also organizations of African American trade unionists were very supportive of the strike and the boycotts. The A. Philip Randolph Institute, and there's another African American trade union group whose name escapes me at the moment, but there was a long record of support for that, and vice versa too, because farm workers, when they went to cities, were also reaching out to Chicanos and Latino workers in cities and for support, and obviously there was a lot of feeling of kinship there, but in many cases those workers were also looking for alliances with African American workers in pursuing their own goals against discrimination and for social change. So I think there's a lot of history to this, and whether it becomes something that's an active element depends on the particular circumstances. There's a lot of talk in the US, as I'm sure you know, about why it is that people of color have infection rates from COVID that are far above the population in general. And so I think there are people who are doing this kind of comparative analysis about that, looking at the impact of racism on infection rates and how racism and economics and job situation, when we talk about meatpacking workers, for instance, especially in the Southeast and states like Texas, meatpacking plants, the workforce is very, very often a combination of African American and immigrant workers. Of course, those immigrant workers are coming in from a lot of different places. Looking at why African American workers in those situations are infected by the virus in large numbers obviously has some parallels with looking at farm workers and looking at Latinos. So I think there are people who are doing that work. I'm not sure. Well, occasionally you see an article in the New York Times about the infection comparative rate. They're doing so much coverage of the coronavirus that it's hard to think of anything that they haven't talked about to some degree or another. So yes, they're talking about that one.
Studies, but like you said, not so much action.
Right. Yeah. Studied something to death, and maybe by the time we're finished studying it, something will have happened. Around the right to form independent unions, this is really interesting, and I think a great question. Well, and the first thing I think that is really we ought to say is that on paper, the rights of Mexican workers have always been better than the rights of workers in the US, long before NAFTA trade agreements or anything like that. And in some ways, the problem of Mexican workers in relation to those rights
is like the problem of US workers in relation to our rights, because we do have labor legislation in the US, and yet any worker knows that joining a union is going to get you fired or can get you fired, and that the employer is not going to pay any penalty as a result of it. So the problem is enforcement. And, you know, I think I'm very much of a, I don't want to say a cynic, because a cynic sounds like, you know, you don't believe in reality. I mean, I think the reality even of NAFTA and its labor side agreement, which was supposedly directed at enforcement, the labor side agreement of NAFTA was essentially an agreement that said that Mexico would have to enforce its own labor law. Now, in theory, it said the same thing about the US and Canada. And of course, the record of that side agreement was that it was a total joke. There's not a single worker that you can point to that ever got their job back because of a NAFTA complaint, or a union that ever got its bargaining rights because of that. And I think that it showed, what it showed was that the process of the negotiation of the treaty and those supposed labor rights aspects of it was very cynical. It was really basically particularly democratic administrations and democratic negotiators who were using that as a way of trying to chip off Democratic Party opposition to the trade agreements so that enough votes could be gotten together to pass the agreement in '92 in the case of NAFTA, and now in the case of that new agreement with, again, the same discussion about, in fact, the discussion this time I think is even more cynical than it was last time, because last time at least there was the pretense that we were going to enforce the labor rights of workers in all three countries. This time, the new agreement says absolutely nothing about the United States and Canada. There is not a single word in those agreements that says that the US is obligated to enforce its own labor law. So the whole thing is a kind of a chauvinistic display, I guess you would say. And the purpose of it, again, I think is overwhelmingly to get enough support in Congress to ratify that agreement, which it did. It worked. It worked. AFL-CIO finally said it supported that. And now it's saying, well, Mexico must, you know, well, first of all, I think it was, there was a lot of chauvinism in the discussion, especially in our labor movement. And I'm a labor guy. I worked for 25 years as an organizer, so I'm not an anti-union person, but I will say this, and that is that the way in which our labor federation has talked about the rights of Mexican workers in this trade agreement, I think has been very chauvinistic, because first of all, Mexico did reform its labor laws at the tail end of the last administration, the Peña Nieto administration. Now, there was a certain pressure on the Mexican government to do this because the Mexican government wanted a trade agreement, and democratic support supposedly for the trade agreement relied on getting some reforms of Mexican labor law. And I think the main reform that was being discussed was the freedom of association, that people should be able to belong to the union of their choice, and that the existing Mexican sort of corporate process of the Juntas de Conciliación y Arbitraje, the Mexican government apparatus, had to be junked because it was too close to the companies and it was too close to previous administrations who had seen labor law as a way to guarantee that foreign investors would not have labor troubles in their maquiladoras if they invested in Mexico. So, but when we look at those two demands, the main force in Mexico that had been pushing for those demands for 20 odd years have been the left wing of the Mexican labor movement. You know, the National Union of Workers, the Frente Auténtico del Trabajo, the Mexican Electrical Workers Union. They came up with proposal after proposal after proposal for reforming Mexico's labor law. And finally, with that push from the negotiated the trade agreement, they were able to win some of those reforms that the Peña Nieto government had to agree to introduce them into Congress. Congress approved them. They were finally signed. They are important reforms. Otherwise, you know, Mexican unions wouldn't have fought for them, and Mexican workers wouldn't have fought for them. They are important reforms, but they didn't come about because US unions somehow forced the Mexican government to grant workers these rights. You know, that's the chauvinism of it, that US unions that sat on their hands over the last 20 years since the big upsurge of the 90s, who sat on their hands over the last 2 decades and really they didn't defend the Mexican Electrical Workers Union when it was busted by Felipe Calderon. You know, they didn't defend other workers threatened by privatization. They didn't stand up for farm workers in Baja California when they went on strike in 2015. They did nothing. And then to claim that they were somehow, you know, responsible for this wonderful reform of Mexican labor law was pure, you know, not true, untrue. That being said, then there is a big question now, though, about, okay, what is going to happen in Mexico in terms of the implementation of that law? And so, again, our Labor Federation has been very critical of the Mexican government, saying, oh, AMLO is moving too slow and he's not doing this and he's not doing that. You know, looking at what's happened in Mexico in terms of the reform, I think it is moving kind of slow, but it's not moving. And there's a lot more. Look at what is happening in the United States. Do we have any proposal for the reform of our labor law in Congress? You know, Democrats haven't even introduced one, let alone tried to make it part of the labor agreement. So, I mean, there's certain hypocrisy there. But, you know, that law does need to be, the changes to the labor law reform does need to be enforced. And the Secretary de Trabajo y Provisión Social needs to put more pressure on Mexican employers on the part of workers. It's not just the implementation of the reform. You know, they were pretty standoffish in Matamoros when there were those first strikes after AMLO came in to defend the minimum wage, his proposal on the minimum. So here you had AMLO saying, well, the minimum wage has to double. And then when the employers tried to cheat, the government did not basically send in the troops to force them to do it. The same thing happened with the virus in the maquiladoras. AMLO said the maquiladoras have to shut. You can't operate during a pandemic. It's too dangerous. The companies refused, a lot of the companies refused to shut down. At Lear, there were 12 people that died in the factory as a result of the continuing operation of the plant. Workers themselves in Juarez and in Mexicali and Tecate and Tijuana went on strike to force the companies to shut down. They did, some of them finally. And then you had the US Defense Department and the ambassador in Mexico City go and meet with AMLO and with the government and say, you cannot shut down the supply chains for the US Defense Department or for the big auto manufacturers. And the Mexican government caved and let the companies reopen again. So it's sort of like push and pull, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And workers are doing what they can do to try to resolve this. In relation to farm workers, it's even more difficult because the labor law reform left farm workers out, which is no surprise to anybody because, you know, they were left out of Mexican labor law historically, just like they were left out of US labor law. On the other hand, they're very active. You know, they do have a union in Baja California. There are struggles for those workers to organize. There's a lot of support for them in the Mexican labor movement and on the left in Mexico. So I don't think that we've, you know, that they are just simply sitting on their hands and waiting for something to happen. But, you know, they are relatively, compared to other parts of the workforce, have a lot less power and a lot less organization.
Okay, we have a couple other questions coming up. David Barkin has had his hand up for some time. If you unmute yourself, we'll hear from you now, David. And then after that, Bruce Hobson.
Hi, David.
How are you? It's a continuation of what you were just saying. Under the new, the revised free trade agreement, the United States claims that it has the right to revise or oversee working conditions in Mexican factories according to, and the application of Mexican labor standards within Mexican factories. I gather that that's not reciprocal from what you just said. Am I correct?
Yes.
And that's extraordinary.
It sure is.
Yep.
I mean, and you would think that our trade union federation would have some concern for our own welfare as workers here in the United States, but you sure couldn't tell it from looking at that agreement.
And can you explain why the U.S. labor movement didn't raise a lot of problems about that? Or is that just their inability to do anything under the current national administration?
Well, I think that's certainly one factor of it. You know, as always in our labor movement, you know, the questions oftentimes gets put in terms of, you know, well, do we want to be at the table or not at the table, right? So Trump had negotiated this guy Lighthizer, and Lighthizer knew how to talk to unions in a way that made them, you know, at least he would talk to them, right? And so those people who said, well, we have to be at the table, they're sort of the people who run the show in terms of legislation anyway. So it's no surprise that, you know, they felt they had to negotiate with Lighthizer and the Trump administration all along. They were also negotiating in tandem with other parts of the Democratic Party, you know, Nancy Pelosi. And they wanted a trade agreement. Democrats have historically wanted a trade agreement. You know, there was never any question, I think, that the mainstream of the Democratic Party was going to force a trade agreement down our throats. The main question was on what terms? You know, were they going to be able to get terms that they could then say were, you know, represented concessions that were large enough that it made it, you know, acceptable. And those concessions, you know, well, first of all, a lot of them had, you know, relatively little to do with workers' rights per se. And those that did had to do more with the concerns of certain unions, auto workers, machinists, steel workers, about the impact of imports into the US. And again, wanting to restrict imports. So when they were able to look at these proposed modifications in the new treaty as being, you know, like for instance, the $16 an hour wage, that somehow the wages in the Mexican auto assembly plants belonging to US manufacturers were going to have to come up to a $16 an hour average in order for those parts to cross the border into the US. Well, you know, I think that unions were willing to sort of buy into that one and say, well, okay, you know, that's good for the Mexican worker and good for the US worker, because, you know, it's going to reduce the self-interest of General Motors and other companies in relocating jobs to Mexican plants. But, you know, in reality, those changes are very small and I think very insignificant. They are not going to change the working conditions and the economic conditions for the overwhelming bulk of Mexican workers. And I think that when you look at what's going on in Mexican unions right now, you don't see a great cooperation between Mexican unions and US unions in the interest of trying to sort of implement the treaty and get you know, the labor law reforms implemented. I think Mexican unions are very skeptical about what the attitude of US unions is right now. And as witness, you know, here you had a Mexican corporation, Grupo Mexico, that had forced its own workers out on strike in Cananea, and in Tasco over 10 years, then bought Asarco, the US mining company, and then became the employer of members of the United Steelworkers Union in Arizona and New Mexico, forced them out on strike. You go, here you have a situation in which the rest of the labor movement could have very easily looked at that and said, if there was ever a case where we had to cooperate across the border and really make this a sort of a test case about what the new relationship is going to be, that didn't happen. The miners in Arizona, the Steelworkers Union, I think they pretty much fought all by themselves. They got support from their own union, the steelworkers, but I didn't see caravans of support from Illinois going down to Arizona even for the US workers that were on strike, let alone for the Mexican workers that were on strike for the same company. So I think it has to do also with what we have done as the left in our own labor movement and our failure to continue to fight the battles to really reinforce the idea that we need an internationalist solution to our problems, the problem of our relationship between workers in the US and the workers in Mexico. We have to learn how to fight together. And the negotiation of that treaty was a great example of that, because the US unions did not negotiate in cooperation with their Mexican counterparts there. If anything, they were kind of doing it in opposition. So I think we've actually sort of fallen backwards to some degree. I think that there was more solidarity and more international cooperation between US and Mexican unions in the 1990s and at the very beginning of the 2000s than there is now. We're going to have to rebuild a lot of that, I think, now in the wake of this new treaty and what it represents.
And just to follow up on that, I mean, I live in Michoacan, where Driscoll is very, very big.
Mm-hmm.
And Driscoll is promoting, although not, perhaps not consciously, it's promoting a destruction of the aquifers and of the environment. And ironically, pushing systems of work and contracting that are feeding into the organized crime control of the communities within the area. I just thought I'd leave that as a little bit of folklore as part of your discussion of what Driscoll does in the US.
Well, they not only do that, David, I don't know if it's true so much in Michoacan, I haven't heard, but I do know that they do it in Baja California. And that is, they use the H-2A visas as sort of a carrot to keep control over their workforce by saying to their workers, look, if you work hard and you're a good worker, maybe you will qualify to get sent to the US to work for Driscoll's on the other side under an H-2A visa. So, no, Driscoll's is a very sophisticated corporation, for sure.
And now they're moving into Oaxaca.
Oh boy.
And I mean, it's absolutely incredible what they're doing there. But that's not the subject of this meeting with the Global Justice Center.
Well, send me whatever information you have about Oaxaca. I'd be very interested in reading it. Thanks for alerting.
Okay. Bye-bye.
By the way, I should point out that in a couple of weeks, we have a webinar coming up on NAFTA, NAFTA 2.0. How is it different from the original NAFTA? Bruce Hobson has been waiting to ask his question. So unmute yourself and tell us what it is.
Great. Hey, David, good to see you. Just right off the top, all that you've been talking about just makes me think and know that, work is hard. And for farm workers, it's not just the work, it's life. Life is hard in every respect, as you were expressing so well. And honestly, you know, all that you've been saying makes me think that UE or some other labor organization or somebody ought to do an updated edition of Labor's Untold Story and incorporate, you know, really in a succinct way, exactly what you're talking about. I mean, that's the book that I grew up with, and I still think it's a great book. What I wanted to, just a couple of things, and I'll try to be brief. The first is about a question of basic rights out in the fields. One is that I'm aware of because I used to work out of Davenport on the Central Coast, and I was supporting farm workers, and I learned a lot about the history of farm workers from people in working in the various agricultural ranches. The only one of which up there, Swantonberry Farm, it's the only one that's organized by UFW. And I learned a lot about the conditions of life of workers there in about 9 different agricultural ranches. One thing that I learned is that life in the ranches and out in the barracks and out in the fields doesn't give people much time to do anything else besides work, come home, eat, maybe drink. But knowing that at least half of the farm workers who I knew were sending remittances every payday to their families in Mexico, and these are overwhelmingly Mexicanos. But that, and remittances happen to be one of the cornerstones of the Mexican economy, besides several other basic parts of the Mexican economy. Something that we've talked about in our Mexico Solidarity Project that Meju and I, and my neighbor right behind me who can't be sitting next to me, Javier Bravo, who you've met, have been talking about is what it means in terms of the political situation and the victory of Morena and López Obrador in 2018. Mexicanos, undocumented and documented in the United States, can vote. But the idea of voting in your home country really is something that's far away from your day-to-day reality of life, of work, of providing for your family, etc. But yet, it is something that we've been talking about in terms of trying to get some, working with Morena, who doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the capacity right now to develop any kind of a structure in the United States for like an electoral strategy with Mexicanos in the United States, whether farm workers or in other areas of labor. But just wondering, is this something that amongst folks who you are in contact with, David, up and down the West Coast, with the relationship, the political relationship in terms of their lives and what's happening in Mexico today?
In terms of the right of people to vote in Mexican elections, you mean?
Specifically, yeah.
Well, I think that, you know, it's sort of comes and goes, or it has peaks and valleys. Obviously, the closer we get to a presidential election, the more interest there is. And, you know, it's like electoral politics in general. I think that well, I remember at the beginning of the 2000s, well, first of all, you know, the big peak of interest that I remember among people voting here in Mexican elections happened in the first 2 campaigns of Cuauhtemoc. And that was before there really was a structure for people to vote here. So it was really more a struggle to win the right to vote in Mexican elections. And to a certain extent, I think it succeeded in reducing the restrictions. You know, you used to have to go down to the consulate and you had to have notarized statement of your, place of birth and so forth in order to be able to cast a ballot. Right.
Electoral card.
And, those restrictions are somewhat looser now. Candidates did campaign in the US in Mexican elections, El Rey de Tomate and all the rest of it. I think that happens less now than it did. And I'm not exactly sure what the reason for that is, but I kind of see less of that activity. Morena, perhaps you know better than I. I don't think that Morena had a big campaign in the US in this last election. It didn't see the US vote as being crucial to winning, which I think is what it takes. When a Mexican party finally sees that the vote in the US could determine the results of the election, I think that we will see more action on voting here, because the problem of reducing the restrictions is not going to be won just by people here. In fact, I think even really mostly by people here, because really laws get passed in Mexico about this, not here. It's not like people here can pass laws that will then govern their own right to vote. Here in the US, we are having this enormous discussion about the mail-in ballot, right? Think of what the mail-in ballot would mean in a Mexican election if all of the Mexican nationals living in the United States were able to simply, well, first of all, got a ballot in the mail, and then were able to simply fill it out and return it. That would produce some enormous changes. But, that's also connected with the way in which migrants in Mexico itself look at their voting power. All of the border cities, all of the border states, especially the ones on the west here, Sonora and Baja California Norte, and Baja California Sur too, are states in which migrants from the South, Chihuahua, migrants from the South make up a majority of the population. So if we're talking about migrants, we're talking about people who have moved up to the border, say, in the last 25 years. So why have we not seen an enormous social revolution or social change, given especially that those people who came up here as migrants wound up in the worst jobs, in the most insecure housing, all the rest of it? I think that there have been individual campaigns. I remember there was this guy, Celerino Garcia, who ran for deputy in the San Quintin Valley at one point at the beginning of the 2000s as the representative of indigenous people based on the social movements of his brother, Benito Garcia, and other people. With this idea that if we could only mobilize the voting power of migrants in Baja California, and what the obstacles were. And of course, the predictable obstacles of, the opposition of employers who wouldn't let their workers off in order to vote, the fact that people were actually registered to vote in their home communities in Oaxaca and not in Baja California, and so forth and so on. Lots of logistical difficulties, but still, you look at what the potential is, and I think it has to do with the left in Mexico, that it does not see the registration and the mobilization of migrants, whether they are living in northern Mexico or whether they're living in the United States, as being of sufficient political importance to be worth bothering about. We have had, Michoacan has a position in the state legislature of a person who is elected to represent Michoacan residents living in US, living in exile. Oaxaca got one. So, there is some recognition and some acknowledgement of this. But it's still a long ways away, I think, from seeing this as a real central issue and a central power question in Mexico, especially for the left.
Right. Another real quick one. David, are you familiar with, do you know about Huichol tobacco workers in the mountains of Jalisco?
No.
I'll talk to you later about that.
Okay.
Yeah, we have time for one last question. And we have this question that came in, which I will screen share with you, from Helen Boning. She says, it is my impression that the USA is working as hard as it can to produce machines that can do the picking and packing, and they can even use US citizens to drive or run the machines. Solves many perceived problems, immigration being the main one. But then no need to house migrant labor, no language problem. Do you see this happening?
Well, mechanizing jobs in agriculture is a project of long standing, and University of California in Davis has long had the reputation as being the growers' sort of think tank where they invent the machines to do this, and they've had some success at it. Cotton has long since been mechanized. There are no people who pick cotton by hand in the United States anymore, and there used to be, in fact, the largest farm worker strike in the history of the United States happened in 1933 among cotton pickers in California, in the Central Valley. So they did it with cotton. Tomatoes, not so much tomatoes for eating, but tomatoes for canning and for processing are picked by machine now. They have machines now that can pick wine grapes. And they're starting to plant wine grapes in rows and in structures, lattices that are specifically designed for the machines. And, I read in the grower press that they want to do this for apples. Now they're looking about how to develop the apple machine. And I think what drives this primarily is money. When the cost of labor rises beyond a certain point, they think that they can, even though it requires the investment of capital in machinery, that they can lower the cost of labor eventually by using machines to replace people. That's the dream. And of course, if they can get the tax-paying public to pay for the development of those machines, so much the better, which is what UC Davis and the ag department there does for them. That being said, though, I think that there are limitations still on what can be picked by machine and what has to be picked by hand. And I think that there are even larger questions that it brings forward. One is that, well, first of all, just as a sort of reality check, the number of farm workers in California is going up, not going down. So even with mechanization, the need for labor, human labor, is still a very, very, very big need. We have 750,000 people in California who make their living as farm workers. So that's a lot of people. But the other one is what people like Rosalinda Guillen and people in the food sovereignty movement keep on raising. And that is that the system of industrial food production is ultimately unsustainable. And of course, people point right away to chemical use, that the use of fertilizers and pesticides has become so problematic that even the largest growers now have an organic division of their operations, as Driscoll's being the prime example. You go to the supermarket, you can buy organic Driscoll strawberries or non-organic Driscoll strawberries, depending on how much money you want to spend. So the mechanization question, I think, is sort of part of that, is because the mechanization of crops requires growing crops at a very large scale. To develop a machine to pick a crop that is only going to be grown on 2 acres is not economically viable, not under capitalism at least. So if in fact we have alternatives about how food production can be restructured, even under capitalism. We're not talking about, achieving socialism and then doing it, but trying to, for instance, the movement for connecting producers and consumers together more closely, which is what farmers markets are about, and which is what, small producers cooperate. Swan is the ideal example of that. Swan is a company that sells its strawberries either at the farm itself or at farmers markets, and its whole existence is dependent on this idea of the consumer and Swan's, the producer, being directly in touch with each other and without Safeway in between. That's still a very small part of US food production. But I was talking with people in Puerto Rico who said that when the virus started, that the co-ops in Puerto Rico, both the producers and the consumer co-ops in Puerto Rico, survived much better than the commercial producers and retailers did. And that they actually grew, their base grew of people who were dependent on that new system for getting food, especially poor people in Puerto Rico. So, I used to sort of dismiss this stuff as being kind of like a nice idea, but not very practical. And I'm beginning to think, well, first of all, the so-called practical alternative isn't very practical either, but also that, we don't have enough imagination sometimes. So maybe part of the answer to this whole question of people being replaced in their jobs by machines is that the system itself has to change. I don't know that this is an immediate answer for the 750,000 farm workers who are wage workers in industrial agriculture in California. And in the meantime, I think the main central question facing those people is their ability to organize and then use their power to change their immediate situation and get better wages and better conditions and so forth. But it's interesting that, farm worker unions are very much part of this discussion about changing the system of food production generally. So, and Rosalinda are the first people who get up in front of organic farmers and say, advocating all very well and good, but if you're not going to advocate for the welfare of the people that produce it, we don't have anything to talk to you about. I think that this is a very important kind of conversation that's going on, and I'm just sort of trying to follow it and see what people like Rosalinda are thinking, but I think that's going to have a lot to do with what the future of machines is in agriculture.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I want to thank David so much for this rich discussion full of information that we need to know more about. If you want to see more of David's photos, this is his website, dbacon@igc.org. There's a ton of photos. You've seen only a few, but you can see at the bottom of his website screen some of the various topics included in his photographic work. And of course, there are his books, which I mentioned at the beginning. So I hope that you will want to explore this subject more. And as I said, in 2 weeks, we will be having a webinar on NAFTA 2.0. And so some of what we discussed today will come up again in that. Thank you so much, David, for very informative presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Our audience should know that all of our revenue-raising programs have been canceled due to the coronavirus. Nevertheless, we continue to pay our Mexican staff. So if you can make a tax-deductible donation, please do so at our website. Thanks for today's program. To Betsy Bowman, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamond, Roberto Robles, Colette Mora, Olivia Canales. These are the people behind the scenes that make things happen. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website. Next Monday, we will have a webinar on the rise of right-wing populism, authoritarianism, and fascism. We've seen a lot of concern in the US in particular on this trend in an authoritarian direction. What does it portend for democracy? We have an international panel for next time. Walter Baer will be speaking from Vienna. Bill Fletcher will be chairing the discussion with his fellow panelists. He's has experience, widespread experience in union work. Sangeeta Kamat, who's from Southeast Asia, will be speaking, and Tarso Ramos, who is with the center that studies right-wing populism. So that's what we have in store for next Monday. I'm sure you won't want to miss this. 1 o'clock Central Time, as usual, on Monday, September 28th. And look forward to seeing you all then, and signing off for now.